What's up everyone, it's Matt Martin with the Grass Factor. So we're moving into the season. Everybody's beginning to gear up to go out with their first round. So I wanted to do another video about nitrogen sources, and I wanted this one to be just more of an overcap of the different forms of nitrogen, enhanced efficiency, nitrogen, urease inhibitors, slow release, polymer coatings, urea form. They all kind of go together and they each have their advantages and disadvantages. So let's jump into this and we'll make this video all about slow release nitrogen. Okay, so first let's break this down into the different classes of slow release nitrogen. First we have urea formaldehydes. These are going to be like methylene urea, triazone urea, IBDU in a sense. These are reactions of urea with formaldehyde that puts a long chain onto that urea molecule that has to be broken down before the urea can actually release. So how this actually breaks down is going to be by microbial activity. The microbes will begin to break down those chains, and as those chains break down, more and more of the urea is released. The advantage of urea formaldehyde is how long it lasts in the soil. It lasts an extremely long time. So depending on how long those chains are, you can apply it. Think of a product like NuFarm, where you could put out 4 pounds of N and it may take 3 to 4 years before those 4 pounds of N actually release. Whereas then you have something like methylene urea with a shorter chain that you put out and it may take 16, 18 weeks for it to fully release. Typically, the way to maximize the initial release and then sustain green from the nitrogen source is to apply it in combination with a quick release. So that would be, you use like a 50% solution of methylene urea with a 50% solution of just urea. The advantage of something like a urea formaldehyde is that it could be available in liquid and in granular form. So there's multiple different ways you can go about that. The disadvantage with it is the inconsistency, and also as urea formaldehydes release, they typically do not give the intensity, the color response that you would get from a quick release or a polymer coated or sulfur coated release. So that'll cover urea formaldehyde. Okay, next I will talk about polymer coated ureas and PCSEU ureas, that's polymer coated sulfur coated urea. Polymer coatings are pretty interesting. There are two major players on the market. One comes from Koch Industries, the other comes from Harrells, and then there's actually another two. There's a third one, and that would be coming from Agria. And what these do is that they, so for instance, the Harrells Polyon technology, so you take your traditional urea prill, and then they react a polymer onto the base material. It actually adheres onto the urea particle. So what happens is that you get a strength of prill, because if a polymer coating is damaged, you interrupt the integrity of that prill releasing into the soil. So if it actually has damage, it's actually going to delay the release into the soil. You have that technology, and then you have like a Poly Plus from Lesco, which typically comes from Koch Industries. And again, it's another coating. It's very temperature dependent. So the degradation of those polymers typically happens with heat, more so than moisture. The warmer it is, the more moisture is allowed into that prill, which ultimately means more urea can make its way out of the prill. The problem when you're dealing with something that is temperature dependent is the unpredictability of temperature. So if we're trying to sustain color on a cool season grass through the warm period, so say you want a really slow release, micro spoon feeding urea through the course of from June, July, August, September before your next feeding, then it may be something you look at with a polymer coating to give you that duration, another brand of polymer coating, to give you that polymer coating to extend the course of the growing season when nitrogen fluctuations, peaks and valleys in nitrogen can ultimately lead to disease. So to manage that, one may use a slow release fertilizer to extend the drip feeding effect of nitrogen through the hottest part of the summer. So the issue is that when you have a polymer coating and it gets to be really hot outside, it breaks down that polymer coating and you get a faster release. So when you're dealing with a cool season grass and it may be sensitive for you to actually begin to release it, what happens is you may get an all of a sudden huge flush of release and then ultimately cause damage or disease issues. One thing in particular that I've run into an issue with using a polymer coated technology is a huge release on weeks of 100-degree weather on cool season grass, and it's led to significant amounts of drought stress and then ultimately burn or kill areas of the lawn. So polymer technology is good, but you have to understand where to use it as a tool. You have to understand where to use it as a turf type. Okay, now we'll talk about sulfur coatings. So the way a sulfur coat is going to work is by impeding the flow of moisture into the prill. So what this means is that as you have your polymer coated prill, your sulfur coated prill, as it rains, moisture gets on it. That sulfur coating is going to slow the movement of water into it and ultimately the water out of it, delaying that release of urea into the soil. So I tend to prefer things like a sulfur coated urea because it tends to have a little more predictability reacting with water than with just temperature dependence. So the advantage of a polymer coating would be that you could put multiple layers of polymer coatings on urea to extend that duration. And then you also have the ability to put a sulfur coating on a urea prill and then put a polymer coating on top of it. So you have then two modes of action working to delay the release of that nitrogen or extend the release of that nitrogen. More so, I think to preface this whole thing is that traditional slow release technologies typically deal with delaying the release of nitrogen. That's why you see it in like a 50-50 blend, where 50% of the nitrogen you apply is going to be a delayed release with a polymer or sulfur coating. And then you also have 50% that would be applied as quick release. So we'll say you're applying a 2400 with 50% XCU. XCU being the controlled release PCSEU. So of that 2400, 12 of it, that would be 50% of your 24 units, 12 units would be releasing over a period of 8 weeks or 6 weeks. Whereas the other 50% would be releasing over a period of 2 weeks. So what happens is you get this immediate flush from the quick release fertilizer, and that's going to extend up to 2 weeks, and then it'll begin to decline in color. But then at that 2 week to 4 week point, you're going to have the slow release kick in. So you have these crossing of, you have this peak, and then you have another peak coming here, and then that also will taper off over time. So it's controlling the peaks there. There's your different coatings, your slow release forms of urea. You have microbial activity from your urea formaldehydes, you have temperature with your polymer coated ureas, and you have water with your sulfur coated. So next we'll move into urease inhibitors. So when it comes to urease inhibitors, most of what we see on the market right now come from two different forms. So there is dicyandiamide, and that is going to be one of the main actives in U-Flex and in Lesco's brand of U+. And then the other would be from the Umax variety of urease and denitrification inhibitors. Umax is going to be from N-thiophosphoric triamide, something along the lines of that. And It's kind of interesting. So not only do the two actually block the enzyme urease from reacting with urea, which ultimately breaks down into NH4 and CO2. NH4 is ammonia gas that can be taken up by the root system and uses nitrogen. It can also turn into nitrate in the soil, which is going to be subject to leaching but can also be used by the plant. Whereas with the N-butyl thiophosphoric triamide, the Umax variety, what happens is, yes, it blocks the urease enzyme, but it also blocks soil bacteria from turning ammonia into nitrate. So it will work on something like ammonium sulfate to a degree. Again, this is one of those products where you know, Umax would work well with ammonium sulfate to it's going to allow the ammonium sulfate to immediately release in terms of the ammonia gas that is produced. However, as that breaks down into nitrate, it will be slowed by that denitrification inhibitor. In regards to Umax or Uflex or N+ in relation to urea, what happens is that it actually blocks the release of urea for a sustained period of time. So by blocking that enzyme urease from reacting with the urea, you're delaying the release of the actual plant available nitrogen from your urea application. Typically you get a bigger color response from a urease inhibitor or a denitrification inhibitor, because it's going to stabilize that nitrogen. That's why they're called nitrogen stabilizers more so than a technical slow release, because it doesn't actually slowly release any nitrogen. It just blocks the conversion of the supplied urea into a usable nitrogen source. So it's more of a delayed release. And by blocking that chemical reaction that with the urease enzyme, you know, it may be a little bit longer of an onset come on of the urea, but once it does come on, it tends to come on with full force because more of that urea is plant available. It's going to be same thing with the denitrification inhibitors and ammonium sulfate, except you get that immediate release from the ammonia gas, but it will help extend the duration of an application of ammonium sulfate to allow it to last longer in the soil. So these are pretty neat products because of the enhanced efficiency. I'll go ahead and throw up a chart now detailing the typical percentages you see in terms of how much urea applied equates to actual plant available nitrogen. So what's interesting is, first off, Koch put this out. Koch is going to be basically the producer of everything that is polymer coated or polymer coated sulfur coated urea. They pretty much own the industry on urea. When you think urea, think Koch Industries. They're the mega empire. So what's interesting is if you take just a straight 100% urea from a 1 pound of actual in application of urea, Koch sees only 36% of that urea being converted into a usable nitrogen source. So you're only going to take up 36% of 1 pound. So roughly a third pound of nitrogen will be taken up from a 100% urea application. Whereas if you take a 100% XCU, which would be polymer coated sulfur coated urea, and you apply it, you get roughly 2/3 of your pound of N that gets taken up by the plant. So what this is this means that urea is extremely inefficient, and even our best technologies are only giving us about 60% uptake of our urea. This is probably the biggest issue I have with urea and why I'm shying away from using more and more of it. You know, you're paying for a pound of N, but you're only utilizing 30 to 60% of the N you apply. It's pretty bad. So In terms of conventional technologies, which, you know, these are advanced chemistries, these are relying on non-natural ways of conventionally releasing nitrogen. It's really inefficient. Let's compare this to what we see with a natural way to release nitrogen in terms of color response. I don't know the scientific data behind this. This is purely speculation. And, you know, I hope one day to be able to have the money to be able to fund a project like this. But in terms of tissue analysis and all the science that would have to go into this, I would love to measure how nitrogen is efficiently utilized through supplementation, through application with carbon-based fertilizer, because I would go out on a limb to say that it is much more efficient than our conventional methods of application. Okay, so in this last section, we'll talk about carbon-based release methods, nitrogen duration methods, using carbon to extend the release of a nitrogen source. So, kind of happenstance, I found this experiment conducted by Auburn University, and it was comparing Biogreen, which would be that's John Perry's product, the RGS product, comparing Biogreen to Urea to Scott's Turf Builder, which would be along the lines of the methylene urea and ammonium sulfate combination that is found in the Mesa technology from Lebanon Turf, as well as ammonium sulfate. And what's kind of interesting here is the color response you see from a ½ pound of N applied per month on Bermuda grass over a 120-day roughly period. The one thing that this doesn't tell me are the days of experiment start. So, you know, if this experiment started in June, it doesn't tell me, you know, 4 months from June, you know, you're looking at October. So it's hard to tell what is going on after 120 days. But it's kind of interesting how the color is much higher when you're seeing a carbon-based fertility nitrogen extension. The color response is really significant, especially on the front end, those first 40 days or so, in relationship to other materials. It tends to kind of dip off at that 50-day mark and then begins to peak back up at that 60-day mark, which would be, of course, in this instance, the you'd be at over 1.5 pounds in apply, and that would continue over into the 100-day mark, and then it begins to tailor off towards 120. And considering that everything tended to tailor off at that time, it tells me that it's the end of the growing season and they're running into light issues. So it's interesting here, the color response on this trial with carbon-based fertility out-competing the other supplied methods. Now, one thing this doesn't compare it to is a traditional urease inhibitor. But in reality, what is happening is that the carbon or the humic substance in a product like RGS is actually acting as a urease inhibitor. I believe the Biogreen product there was it was like a 501, and I think that was derived from urea. So that is the humic acting as a urea stabilizer being applied. And when it comes to this, you know, there's multiple ways to look at it. In terms of building overall soil quality, the added benefit of soil surface area that comes from a humic-based product to extend your nitrogen is going to be much greater long-term than blocking chemical reactions from taking place. It's the whole adage of, do you interrupt nature from taking place, or do you promote nature to take place? In terms of humic, you're promoting nature and natural reactions to take place in the soil microenvironment. Whereas with a urease inhibitor, you're blocking soil biology from taking place. So it's kind of an interesting thing there, and I think it's something that we should all take into consideration when choosing our nitrogen sources. Whether you're using a poly-coated technology, and if you're in the instance where you need a 120 or 180 day release where you only want to apply once every 6 months, if that's you, then yeah, you may want to look at a duration technology with multiple polymer coatings. If you are a professional that's looking to feed every 6 weeks, you may want to look at a stabilized nitrogen source. And you can look at it from a Urease inhibitor or a Uflex or a Umax or a humic based release. If you're spoon feeding, you can do the same thing where you may be microdosing really frequently. The plant is only going to take up so much nitrogen at one time, and it can take it up to the root system, and it can take it up foliarly. So a pound of nitrogen being applied every week is really wasteful because the plant isn't able to utilize that much. So if you want to use a nitrogen stabilizer and spoon feed, we'll say 1/8 of a pound every 2 weeks. That's going to be much more efficient because the plant can take it up as it needs it instead of forcing it into the plant. And in that relationship, you can choose how you choose to take up that material efficiently. So really the whole premise here is in these enhanced efficiency technologies, it's understanding when and where to use them. And so you have to ask yourself is how often do I want to be on the property? How often is feasible to be on the property in terms of relation to plant health? I think you're going to get a healthier plant with smaller amounts of inputs more frequently than you will with larger inputs over a longer period of time, because you have more control over the amount of uptake from the plant. The problem with these polymer coatings is that the technology exists, but technology is ultimately subjected to the wrath of nature, and that leads to a certain amount of unpredictability or improbability to be able to say, well, it's going to release a 1/4 pound a month. These technologies do not have a timer that's going to say, okay, 30 days have passed, we're releasing 0.1 pounds of it. It doesn't have that. So there's a bit of variability there that takes place. In terms of professionals, it's just one thing to keep in mind also as it relates to cost. Urea in general is very cheap. It's extremely cheap, but it's also extremely inefficient. So anything you can do to maximize the efficiency of urea, you're benefiting, you're bang for your buck. So anyway, y'all, that's going to be my video talking about urea. Just wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm planning on doing a follow-up with ammoniacal nitrogen sources, so your ammonium nitrates, your ammonium sulfates. So anyway, that's my video. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Y'all take it easy. Have a good one.